In November 1944, General George S. Patton stood in front of a line of black American tankers and told them something few white officers had ever said before. "You are the first Negro tankers to ever fight in the American Army. I don't care what color you are. I care whether you killed Germans." They had trained for 2 years in segregated camps. They had been told they weren't ready, that they weren't capable, that they would fail. Then Patton sent them straight into one of the bloodiest winters of the war, the Battle of the Bulge. What happened next would force the U.S. Army to rewrite its own assumptions. But when the war ended, America still wasn't ready for them. The 751st Tank Battalion was activated in 1942 at Camp Claiborne, Louisiana. It was an all-black unit in a segregated army, an army that officially allowed them to serve, but unofficially doubted they should fight. White officers commanded them. Black soldiers trained under constant scrutiny. Every mistake was seen as proof. Every success was called luck. Many senior commanders believed black troops lacked aggressiveness. Others argued they didn't have the mechanical aptitude for armored warfare. So the 751st trained and trained and trained for nearly 2 years. While white tank battalions deployed to Europe, the 751st remained stateside. Inspectors came and went. Reports were written. Exercises were repeated. Always one more evaluation. Always one more delay. Some of the men began to believe they would never fight. But inside the battalion, something hardened. They called themselves the Black Panthers. Their patch showed a panther coiled and ready to strike, and they meant it. They knew that when, or if, they were finally sent overseas, they would not only be fighting Germans, they would be fighting the doubts of their own country. When the 751st Tank Battalion finally arrived in France in October 1944, they did not receive a hero's welcome. They received a test. General Patton needed tank units. The Third Army was pushing east, and resistance was stiffening. German defenses were layered, disciplined, and desperate. Patton had a reputation. He wanted speed, aggression, results. And he was warned about the 751st. Some officers quietly suggested keeping them in reserve. Others recommended attaching them only in limited roles. Patton disagreed. He told them directly, "Men, I don't care what color you are. I care whether you can kill Germans." It wasn't kindness. It wasn't social progress. It was a battlefield contract. If they performed, they would fight. If they failed, they would confirm every prejudice waiting to be proven right. Their first major combat came near the French town of Morville-le-Vicq. Cold rain, thick mud, narrow roads bordered by hedgerows and minefields, German anti-tank guns hidden in tree lines, every intersection potentially fatal. The Black Panthers rolled forward in their Shermans. The first tank in the column was hit within minutes. A German 88mm round tore through the armor. The crew bailed out under machine gun fire. There was no time to hesitate. Other tanks pushed past the burning wreck and returned fire. They advanced through artillery bursts and ambush positions. Infantry units, initially skeptical, began watching closely. The 751st did not break. They maneuvered under fire. They coordinated with infantry. They held positions when counterattacks came at dusk. Within days, something shifted. White infantry officers who had doubted them began requesting them. Reports changed tone. Combat effective, reliable under fire, aggressive. The battalion that had trained for 2 years without deployment was now in continuous combat. And there would be no pause. In November, as the weather worsened and supply lines stretched thin, German forces began preparing a massive counteroffensive. The Ardennes, what would later be called the Battle of the Bulge. When the German attack exploded in December, American lines shattered in multiple sectors. Units were overrun, roads clogged with retreating vehicles. Snow fell heavy and fast. Patton needed every tank he had. The 751st was ordered north. They were no longer a test case. They were now part of the line that would stop Hitler's last gamble in the West. By mid-December 1944, the Ardennes forest had turned into a frozen graveyard of stalled vehicles and shattered divisions. Snow swallowed the roads. Fuel froze in lines. Wounded men froze in foxholes. When the German offensive broke through American positions on December 16th, chaos followed. Entire units were cut off. Towns changed hands in hours. Rumors spread faster than orders. The 761st Tank Battalion was thrown into that storm. No ceremony, no headlines, just coordinates on a map and a command: move north. Their Shermans struggled through icy mountain roads. Engines roared against the cold. Tracks slipped on frozen ground. Every clearing could hide a German Panther or Tiger tank. The Black Panthers were attached to infantry units that had never fought beside them before. Some of those infantrymen had doubts. They wouldn't have them for long. Near the town of Tillet, German forces had dug in with anti-tank guns covering the approaches. Snowdrifts masked minefields. Visibility was barely a few hundred yards. The first exchange was brutal. An American tank was hit and disabled. Another took shrapnel damage. Infantry scattered under machine gun bursts from tree lines. The 761st adjusted fast. Instead of pushing blindly forward, they used bounding overwatch, one tank covering while another advanced. They coordinated with riflemen, clearing houses block by block. They fired high explosive shells into fortified barns and stone buildings. They did not retreat. For days they fought in temperatures that dropped below zero. Crews slept inside steel hulls that held the cold like coffins. Frostbite cases mounted. Rations were frozen solid. And still they moved. At Bastogne, American forces were surrounded. At other points along the line, the Germans punched deep. Patton's Third Army pivoted north in one of the fastest operational turns of the war. The 761st helped hold critical crossroads and retake lost ground. White officers who once questioned their aggressiveness now wrote in after-action reports, performed with distinction, steady under severe enemy pressure, essential to breakthrough. But the price was mounting. Tanks knocked out, crewmen killed, friends buried in frozen soil they would never see again. They were proving themselves in blood, and the cold did not care what color their skin was. When the German offensive finally began to collapse in January 1945, the 761st did not get pulled off the line. They kept advancing toward Germany.
January 1945. The snow began to melt, but the mud was worse. Sherman tanks of the 761st rolled east, deeper into Germany. Town after town fell behind them. Some villages were abandoned, others resisted, house by house. The war was no longer about pushing back an offensive. It was about finishing it. Near the town of Guebling, the battalion ran into one of the hardest fights of its campaign. German anti-tank guns were dug in along a ridgeline, perfectly positioned to cut off the American advance. The first Sherman that crested the rise exploded almost instantly. The second was hit in the tracks. Inside those tanks were men who had grown up being told they weren't fit to fight beside white soldiers. Now they were being asked to take the most exposed ground in Europe. They didn't hesitate. Lieutenant Colonel Paul Bates pushed his companies forward in coordinated waves. Smoke rounds covered advances. Tanks fired point-blank into fortified farmhouses. When infantry units stalled under machine gun fire, 761st tanks rolled forward to draw attention, deliberately exposing themselves so riflemen could maneuver. It was not glamorous fighting. It was brutal, close, mechanical, and it worked. By February, they had breached the Siegfried Line, Hitler's western defensive barrier of bunkers and dragon's teeth. The concrete fortifications that German propaganda claimed were impenetrable. The Black Panthers drove straight through them. But what they found deeper inside Germany would stay with them far longer than any battlefield. In April 1945, elements of the 761st helped overrun a subcamp of the Dachau concentration system near the Austrian border. Nothing in training prepared them for it. The gates were broken, the guards had fled. Inside were human beings who looked less alive than did. Skeletal figures in striped uniforms, eyes hollow, skin stretched tight over bone. The smell hit first: rot, disease, starvation. Tank crews climbed down from their vehicles in silence. Some of these soldiers had spent years being told they were inferior. Now they stood face to face with a system built entirely on racial hatred. They saw where that road ended. One crewman later said, "We knew about prejudice, but this was industrial." The men of the 761st helped distribute food, secure the area, and call in medical teams. They saw bodies stacked like lumber. They didn't speak much that night. They didn't need to. For them, the war had become something different. It wasn't about proving themselves anymore. It was about stopping something evil. And they kept going, toward the Austrian Alps.
May 1945. The guns fell silent. Germany surrendered. The men of the 751st Tank Battalion had fought for 183 consecutive days. They had advanced more than 1,000 miles across France, Belgium, and Germany. They had destroyed over 300 enemy vehicles. They had liberated towns, breached the Siegfried Line, and overrun Nazi strongholds. They had proven themselves in combat, again and again. And then they went home. There were no grand parades waiting for them in small southern towns, no cheering crowds, no newspaper headlines declaring them heroes. They stepped off trains into a country that still had whites-only signs on restaurant doors. Some wore uniforms covered in campaign ribbons. Some were missing friends who would never return. All of them were veterans of one of the hardest campaigns in Europe. It didn't matter. In Texas, a black veteran in uniform could not sit at a lunch counter. In Mississippi, he could not vote. In many places, he could not even walk through the front door of a building he had just risked his life to defend. One former tanker recalled stopping at a roadside diner while still in uniform. The waitress looked at him and said, "We don't serve your kind here." He had just helped defeat the most openly racist regime in modern history, and he was still fighting the same battle at home. For decades, the 751st received little official recognition. Their records were filed, their achievements were noted, but the spotlight never came. Other units were celebrated, books were written, movies were made. The Black Panthers were largely forgotten, until history caught up. In the 1990s, researchers began re-examining overlooked units of World War II. Veterans were aging. Time was running out. The truth was undeniable. The 751st had performed with extraordinary valor under some of the harshest conditions in Europe. In 1997, more than 50 years after the war, President Bill Clinton awarded the Medal of Honor to Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers. He had been recommended for the medal in 1945. The paperwork never moved forward. Rivers had refused evacuation after being wounded. He continued leading his tank platoon until he was killed in action in November 1944. When his widow accepted the medal, it was not just for him. It was for all of them. The battalion eventually received a Presidential Unit Citation, but by then, many of the original Panthers were gone. They had lived full lives, they had raised families, they had carried their memories quietly. They had proven something that never should have needed proving, that courage is not assigned by race, that loyalty does not depend on skin color, that when America needed them most, they answered. The 751st Tank Battalion did not fight for applause. They fought because they believed that the uniform meant something, because the flag meant something, because if America was going to promise freedom, then someone had to defend it, even if freedom had not yet fully reached them. Their motto had been simple: come out fighting. And they did.